Welcome to another edition of Lathe It All on the Table here on Millions.co. I am super excited about my guest today, Larry Schecter. He is the host, or excuse me, the author of The History of Fantasy Sports and the People Who Made It Happen. Larry, appreciate you being here. I'm really excited to talk about your book.
Glad to be here.
So before we get started, I want to give a shout out to some people that make shows on Millions possible. First of all about Vibe. If you're looking for an exciting gift to commemorate a memory with somebody special, and you're looking for a special gift to give somebody, All About Vibe has custom made pillows where you can commemorate a special memory with them. Early, if you're all about that skincare routine, Early has great skincare products, so check them out. And Techco technology, big part of everyday life, big part of the industry here in sportscasting. So it's a great way to kind of keep your technology organized and as well as your accessories. Now, the history of fantasy sports and the people that are involved, the people that got it started. I'm curious I saw an interview the other day where you mentioned it took you about 18 months to complete this book. What inspired you to take on such
Yeah,
massive project?
I like the idea of that pillow. You get that nice soft pillow, lay your head on it while you're reading my book. Be very comfortable reading the book. So yeah, what happened is I've played fantasy sports for years, and I've seen it grow from this thing that very few people knew about, and you get reports in the mail, and it was hard to get information to where now you got millions and millions of people playing all over the world, everything from fantasy baseball and fantasy football to fantasy cricket, fantasy wakeboarding, Iditarod. Um, and you've got a $25 billion a year industry, 50,000 people are employed in the industry. You turn on a professional game, it's got fantasy information. It's gone crazy. So for a long time, I wondered, how did this all happen? How do we go from ideas people had years ago for games to this massive worldwide phenomenon? And I've known somebody should write a book about this because it didn't exist. No one has ever written a book about this. Nobody's ever explained how it happened. So I decided to do it. And I had no idea what I was getting myself into. It ended up taking 18 months full-time work, researching, interviewing dozens and dozens of people, writing the book. Um, so that's what happened.
That's awesome. That's awesome. And speaking of interviewing people, I mean, you've had interviews with some pretty interesting people that you might not think are that involved in the sports world. You've had like including people in politics, Monica Lewinsky, John Kyle. Like, what were their perspective on fantasy sports, and how did getting them involved come about?
Well, I didn't interview John Kyle or Monica
Okay,
Lewinsky, but I did mention them
I mentioned.
because, yeah, because what happened is there were a few very big legal events in the history of fantasy sports, and one is when there was legislation to possibly shut down fantasy sports that was very likely to pass, the Monica Lewinsky scandal happened, and the Congress got sidetracked with Monica Lewinsky and impeachment, so they put off the vote that would have determined fantasy sports as gambling and shut down a lot of the industry. So because of Monica Lewinsky, it got put off for several years, and by the time they got back to it, things had changed, and and fantasy sports was okay. So essentially, I report this in the book, and in the book, I'm not. It's not like about me. It's not about my opinions or whatever. It's about what happened and who did what. Except a couple of times I did throw in an opinion or a conclusion, and in this case, I threw in the conclusion that hey, Monica Lewinsky saved fantasy sports.
That's incredible. Like you've got names that you wouldn't think be involved, and that's really cool. In terms of fantasy baseball, Dan Okrent is or Okrent. I'm not sure how to pronounce the name. I apologize. Is often credited with inventing fantasy baseball, but you told a different story. What actually happened there?
Well, he's the guy credited with inventing fantasy baseball, and there's kind of a myth that ESPN 30 for an ESPN 30 for 30 show really uh, propagated that he kind of magically came up with the idea on an airplane. That's not true. He did come up with the idea, but it goes back years before that. There's a lot involved in the story. It goes back to his college days, 20 years before that. And what happened is a lot of in 1980 he created his version of rotisserie baseball. It was called rotisserie baseball, not fantasy baseball. They named it after the restaurant where they finalized the rules for it, him and some friends. But before 1980, before that, a lot of people were playing their own primitive versions of fantasy baseball. But the difference is in 1980, the game Okran came up with was kind of like chess to everybody else's checkers. That's number one. Number two, he was in the media. He and all the people, friends he got into his first league were in the media in various capacities. So because of them, they were in the media, they got exposure and publicity for the league. They got on a couple of articles were published. They were on the Today Show, and because of this, it spread. People heard about it. By '81, there was a rotisserie league in almost every Major League Baseball press box. In 1984, they got a deal with Bantam Books to publish a book about it. And when that book came out, it sold about 50,000 copies. And most of 50,000 people who bought the book started their own league, and including some people like Ron Chandler, who's a very famous fantasy baseball expert, and Matthew Berry, the
Hmm.
famous Matthew
Yeah.
Berry, 14 years old, bought that book in 1984 and started a fantasy baseball league.
Wow. That's awesome. That's it's really fascinating to see kind of how that all got started. I mean, fantasy sports today is a huge a huge deal today, and it's great that we are kind of getting because of your book. We're kind of getting some insight into all of that. What role did sports pioneers and entrepreneurs play in turning a niche hobby into basically a multi-billion-dollar industry?
Well, as a preface to answering that question, let me say when I started researching the book, my idea was I'm going to write a book called The History of Fantasy Sports. Who did what, when, how did it all happen? As I started researching and interviewing people, I was hearing all kinds of fascinating stories. Some of them were inspirational, some of them were funny, and I realized very early on I could write a book, The History of Fantasy Sports, who did what, when, we get the job done would also come off as a very boring research paper. But by incorporating all these stories I was hearing, it would make the book interesting. It would get the job done, also make the book interesting, easier to read, and not like a dry textbook, history text. So that's what happened. The reviews have been fantastic, and people say it's easier to read, it's fascinating. People who've never played fantasy sports before love it because it's not about how to play fantasy sports or strategy. It's about the stories of how this all happened. So yeah, so as you were saying, it covers the stories of a lot of pioneers and entrepreneurs. What they have in common is they saw a need for something and they created it, or they saw something that existed but they thought they could do better. And a lot of them became very successful and like a guy named Ian Allen and Bruce Taylor, when they were in college, they start playing fantasy football. And this is great, but there's no information. Let's start a magazine. And when computers came out, people who were early computer people and had knowledge of fantasy sports realized, hey, we could do statistics for fantasy sports with this newfangled computer thing. Because before then, it would take the commissioner of the league like 10 hours or so every week doing all the steps by hand. But with a computer, obviously, you can do a lot easier. And there's 150 stories in the book I love, but one of the ones that really stands out is a couple, Jim and Gloria Berger from Pennsylvania, had one of the first statistic services, and I think it was 85 or 86. They did baseball and basketball. And what you would do back then for baseball is you would get the Tuesday USA Today would have all the American League statistics for the week. the Wednesday USA Today would have the National League statistics. So Gloria would read the statistics, Jim would input them into the computer, then they would do all the computer would do all the calculations, print out reports, and they would mail the reports to their clients Wednesday night. So that's kind of like the who did what when. Now the interesting part, this is where I got the subtitle of the book. The book is called The History of Fantasy Sports. The subtitle is In the Stories of the People Who Made It Happen. So the story of people who made it happen here. One Wednesday, Gloria went into labor with her first child, but they didn't let that stop them from doing their job. So in between contractions, Gloria would read the statistics to Jim and he'd put them in the computer. And then she'd be like, oh, wait, hold on, here comes another one. Okay, it passed. And she continued. So they got the report in the mail on time Wednesday night, and their daughter was born that day. And now, 37 years later, the daughter who was born that day plays in a fantasy football league with her dad.
That's incredible. You've got this great thing that they're creating, but it's also based on their own family history. They kind of got a neat family story behind it. That's that's incredible. Another story that you tell in your book that stood out to me was this guy with ALS. He won his fantasy league after 39 years.
Yeah.
Why was this particular story important to you?
Well, this he was not in a fantasy league. This was an APA league. Um,
Mm,
and what happened is what I refer to as fantasy sports is where you're drafting teams and then before the events occur. So like right now in August, people are drafting fantasy football teams, but we don't know yet what's going to occur. They'll accumulate stats for what happens in the season that starts in a month. There were games prior to fantasy sports that were based on things that had already occurred. So those, are kind of precursors to modern fantasy sports. And APA and Stratomatic were two of the biggest ones where they're based on actual professional statistics, but for prior seasons. So when I, first started the book, I thought I'll probably have a very brief mention of like App and Stratomatic as the precursors, some of the precursors for fantasy sports. But once I started researching it, again, I was hearing all these amazing stories. There are people who've been in like APA and Stratomatic leagues for 50 years. They started in high school or college and 50 years later still playing. And it's kept them together all these years, whereas otherwise they would have probably drifted apart, most of them. And then I heard this story about the guy you're referring to. What happened is he was playing in his league, his APA league, for many, many years. And after about 35 years or so, he got ALS. And when that happened, he thought, and everybody else thought, he was going to have to drop out of the league. But his wife said, if you want to keep playing, I'll do whatever I have to do so you can keep playing. So she would go to the games with him and she'd roll the dice for him and he'd tell her what moves to make. And he did this for a few years and it kind of got to the point where he could only communicate through an eye reader and his wife reading his lips. And he had never won the league before, but in that condition, his team came from 2 runs behind in extra innings in the seventh game of the World Series, and he won his first championship in his 39th year. And everybody burst out into tears. So, like there's so many good stories. There are also stories about Bob Costas playing Stratomatic when he was a kid, and John Miller, the Baltimore Orioles announcer, who I think is now the announcer for the Angels, playing Stratomatic, playing on an airplane when the Orioles were flying to the West Coast, or playing a game on an airplane with some of the Orioles and Cal Ripken Jr. And there's just like so many good stories. So what I thought would be like, maybe a brief 2-3 paragraph mention of like Stratomatic and Apple being precursors, it's most of the whole chapter.
That's awesome. That's amazing. I love stories like that. That kind of go, and that seems like your book in general kind of goes beyond just uh, play people playing. fantasy sports and trying to win their leagues. Like it's way above that, and I think that's pretty cool. And another thing that kind of stuck out to me was the women against fantasy sports. What was their story about uh, i- involved, and how did that kind of reveal the cultural reaction about fantasy sports in the beginning?
Well, these were a woman who was kind of annoyed by her husband playing fantasy sports so much, kind of partly serious, partly tongue in cheek. They started this group called Women Against Fantasy Sports, and they would, like their husbands or boyfriends would be at, like they'd be at a party or something, and the husbands and boyfriends would be together talking about their fantasy sports teams, and the women would be together looking at the men, kind of rolling their eyes at these idiots talking so much about their fantasy teams. And they sold some items. One was a T-shirt that said, "I thought I was your fantasy." And their most popular item that sold a lot was women's panties that said "closed for the fantasy season."
Oh, that's quite a story there. There was also in Chicago a covenant of five nuns co-managing a fantasy team. What did that story teach you about like who fantasy sports are really made for?
Well, that story was just one of many that showed me, it's made for everybody. And when I started the book, I had no idea that one of the major themes in the book that would emerge is how fantasy brings everybody together. Like I just mentioned, they're, college or high school friends that have stayed together throughout the years because of fantasy league. Matthew Berry, as I mentioned, was 14 when he started in his first league, and he kept playing with the same people in this league for like years and years. I forget how many years it was. It was many, many years. Once he was not, this was in Texas. Once he moved away from Texas, he would still fly back there every year for his draft. And you got parents and children playing. You got coworkers. There's a draft in Las Vegas, fantasy football draft, where you have a CEO of a major company sitting next to a plumber and they're talking like they're best buddies. So it's like fantasy sports are just great. And among everything else that brings people together is one of the things that I learned, from all the research and whatnot.
How important is that unification in not just your book? Like obviously that's a big part of your book, but like just in general, like how important is that unification when it comes to fantasy sports and just watching sports in general?
Well, I mean, fantasy sports by itself is a great thing. Lots of people love to play fantasy sports, regardless of any connection with anybody else. But then when it brings people together, it's more special, and it's also created some good things from the industry, um, like Scott Fish, for example, put together the Scott Fish Bowl, which it's a fun fantasy football league with lots of people playing, and it raises money for charity.
That's awesome. That's kind of a neat thing that goes above just playing sports. You're doing it for a good cause. That's awesome. I mean, after speaking with so many people who have shaped and like researching people who have shaped fantasy sports, what do you think separates the true pioneers from everybody else?
Well, I mean, the true pioneers, I guess, the people that started things that didn't exist, or improved things that existed, back, it goes back a number of years. But then, even as you get closer to modern times, there's still people who do things like, besides like the basics of inventing fantasy football, inventing fantasy baseball, then you have people who created things that, even more recently didn't exist yet. They had, like, for example, guillotine leagues. Guillotine league is where I guess every week, the team in last place is eliminated from the league and all their players are up for being bid on by the people remaining. So like that was just an innovative idea for a new format that happened not too many years ago. And people keep coming up with new ideas. Daily fantasy sports, didn't exist until about 10 years ago, roughly.
What I mean, you mentioned the kind of evolution of fantasy sports over the years. It's become such a massive industry. Where do you think the next chapter of fantasy sports is headed?
I have no idea. That's like the last line of my book. You gotta go up. The bibliography is like 40 pages long. It's a huge bibliography. Um, yeah, the last line of my book says, "To where will the fantasy industry evolve in 10 years or 20 years or 50 years? I won't even hazard a guess, but I can't wait to find out."
Fair
That
enough. I mean,
that was
yeah,
yeah, that was in the epilogue. And by the way, like Peter Schenke, who was the president of RotoWire, he said a long time ago, several years ago, he said like, once they got to like 20 million people playing fantasy sports in the US, he thought it can't possibly grow any further. But now it's like 50 million people.
how involved are you yourself in fantasy sports?
I've played fantasy football and fantasy baseball for many, many years.
Any tips on this upcoming season in fantasy football? Any players you want to look out for?
Uh, let's see, tip. I would avoid Rome Odunes. Is that how you pronounce his name? I don't know.
I think it's Odunze. I think yeah, it's Roma
Yeah,
Odunze.
it could be Odunes. Yeah, I would avoid him. He's. I mean, I've heard from a medical person that I would not trust his medical condition. That's one tip.
Um, and as far as like, I know we're pretty much almost done with the regular season in baseball. Anything to look out for as we get down to the wire here?
Um, well, there's some concern right now about Paul Steen's last couple of performances. His velocity has dropped, and there's some concern. We'll see what happens there. I'm amazed at the Red Sox. The Red
Yeah,
Sox turned their season around. Unbelievable. I'm a Red Sox fan, so
yeah, they've been incredible. I think they're on a bit of a skid right now, but overall, the way have turned it around. Like it's
yeah.
been what do you specifically look for? Whether it's with your football team or your fantasy baseball team, what is it that you look for when you're drafting your teams?
Well, I look for value. I mean, basically, I project what I think all the players are going to do, and then based on what their value is, the I'll go from there. So I'm looking for a good value relative to their draft position or their dollar value if it's an auction.
And when you were doing research, what were about your book? What were, if any, some misconceptions about fantasy sports that you were able to dispel when writing this book?
Well, one was, as I said, the Dan Okrent mystery and the Dan Okrent misinformation. That was a big one. The idea that he just magically came up with this on an airplane. That was one. Another was discovering so many people were playing primitive versions of fantasy sports, before Okrent came along, before, yeah. And just the fact that people don't know any of this, like 99% of what's in the book, I did not know. And even people who've been in the industry or played fantasy sports their whole lives didn't know much of what's in the book. Paul Charchian, who was the president of the Fantasy Sports Trade Association for like 12 years and has been a very big guy in the industry. In fact, there's a lot of mention about him in the book. He got the book and he did not know much of what was in there. You know,
Was it
there's a couple of brothers named the Ford brothers. They like nobody ever heard of them pretty much. They put together like the first real fantasy hockey game, and at one time in the 80s they had 1 million people in Canada playing fantasy hockey.
wow? That's incredible. when you were doing research, like, did you have any theories going into this prior that were dispelled or proven right?
Not really. I mean, just again, the Oprah thing, which I had no idea how untrue that was. And I didn't know what to expect. Just I would just, as I said, just keep seeing things, learning things like, wow, that's interesting, or oh my God, I didn't know that, or wow, that's funny, or whatever.
I mean, and you mentioned like we've talked a lot about the evolution of fantasy sports and technology, of course, uh, wasn't always as evolved itself when fantasy sports got started. How has technology sort of transformed how we go about fantasy sports?
Well, the first thing, as I mentioned before, was when computers came out. Computers made it, easy to do the stats. Um, Although, like, it's funny, you think of one of the first game companies, CDM Sports. They were like one of the first really big companies offering fantasy games. And Jim and Carol Matthews, another married couple, were the owners of that, along with a guy named Charlie Weger. And Jim and Carol, like on Monday morning in baseball season, or I guess Tuesday in football season, is when they would run their weekly reports. So what they would do is they would start their computer to process all the results for the week when they left for work in the morning. And then one of them would come home at lunch to make sure it was operating properly. And then they would come home after work for dinner. And somewhere in the evening, the computer would be done processing all the reports and they could print them out. And it's really funny hearing that now, because now what 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 was done would happen in like 3 seconds on a computer.
Yeah, it's there's a lot of things that can be done
Yeah.
faster on a computer than
And
they
then to
were.
answer your yeah, and then to answer this your question, but then the biggest thing of course was the internet. When the internet came
Yeah.
along, it made playing so much easier. You could make your own moves on the computer. You could play with other people. It just made it so much easier to play that was, a huge boon to the industry. And, then you got things like live scoring, like it used to be, you'd have to wait. I mean, at the beginning, you'd have to wait for your commissioner to give you the reports every week, a few days later. And then when you had computers, you would wait for them to arrive in the mail a few days later. And then you started to get live scoring where like the statistics would update it. You could go on the internet, like you could go on the internet the day after and see what happened the day before. The reports up to date from the day before. And then you got into more live scoring, like they'd update every 8 hours and they'd update every hour. And now it's like they update every second. If you, a lot of most or a lot of fantasy sports uh, commissioner services, they'll update like every second or every minute or whatever.
Now, getting back to kind of more of the specifics of fantasy leagues, like one of the things that I always struggled with when I would play fantasy sports is okay, my team's kind of on the verge, but they're kind of struggling. Like, how do you know when to like pull a plug on a fantasy trade? Like,
On a trade,
yeah,
well, got to analyze it and figure out, will this help you gain points in the standings? Are you going to gain more than you're going to lose? Um, sometimes it's obvious, like in baseball, for example, if your team is first place in home runs and the second place team is 15 home runs behind and it's already August 11th, it's like you're just wasting home runs at this point. So if you can trade one of your power hitters and get something you need, that makes, this kind of obvious.
that makes a lot of sense. Um, you know, after uncovering all these amazing stories in your for your book, what do you hope readers ultimately take away from the history of fantasy sports?
I think kind of like what I said before, the fantasy sports are great. You know, what happened is I wrote the book, like after editing it and going through it a whole lot, I said, okay, it's now ready to go to my editor. So I sent it to the editor, and one of the comments he made was, you should have an epilogue. And I did not have an epilogue. He said you should have an epilogue, just kind of wrap it all up. Doesn't have to be long. And I thought, okay, that makes sense. So I wrote an epilogue. When I was writing the epilogue, um, two things occurred to me. One is, what is it? Fantasy sports are great. It's like that's why so many people play. It's grown so much. It brings people together. It's kind of like one thing in the epilogue is like fantasy sports are great. And the other thing is, when I was writing the epilogue, it occurred to me I had just done what all these other entrepreneurs and pioneers had done. Like I said, they saw something that didn't exist and they created it. I saw something that didn't exist. We needed a history of fantasy sports. Didn't exist. So I did it. I was like, wow, that's cool. I just did what all these other people did. I saw something that didn't exist and I did it.
That's incredible. It must feel like a big accomplishment when you can put out something new that nobody else has thought of doing. Larry Schecter, author of The History of Fantasy Sports and the People That Made It Happen. Larry, appreciate your time, man.
All right, let me just throw in the book is available paperback and ebook, and actually hardcover is going to be out in a couple of weeks. It's available on Amazon. If you go to Amazon, you can see all the reviews and details. It's also available most other booksellers on their websites. And it's on like Google Play and a lot of the other ebook places.
That's awesome. And you got any other big book ideas coming up?
No, I think
The mo-
this is probably it.
All right. Well, I think it's a
Although
pretty good.
I have been toying with the idea of maybe writing the Leaf Sinclair life story one day.
All right. Well, I'll be sure to hit you up when I'm all set and done. I appreciate your time. It was
All
great
right,
talking
thanks
to
a
you
lot.
about your book.
Okay, thanks.